Okay, this is Thomas Freed on the Liberty Works Radio Network. This is the Truth Attack Hour, and yes, that's right, folks. After 2 weeks away on vacation in a remote location and there was no cell tower to cover the phone, we're back with the Truth Attack. Okay, let's get right into this. We are the Liberty Works Radio Network, and we do need the support of the members of the listening audience to keep the broadcast network operating and the shows and the broadcasts coming. So, if you enjoy the information, the lectures, the topics, the discussions, the revelations that you hear on this show and that you get on the other shows of the network, we sure would appreciate it if you could find your way over to the LibertyWorksRadioNetwork.com website if you're not there listening online. And if you're not already there listening online, and get yourself signed up as a subscribing member, even if it's as little as $15, $20 a month. Every membership helps, and we do need your support to keep the broadcasts coming. So, LibertyWorksRadioNetwork.com. And if you want to get fully informed on the unconstitutional fraud we call the federal personal income tax, you want to find your way over to taxfreedom.com and start reading, because the cat is out of the bag. The facts are irrefutable. The government is caught with its pants down, 2 a.m. in the morning, in the floodlights, crapping in the neighbor's flower garden. Guilty as sin. Guilty as charged for 45 years, which is the amount of time they've been lying to the American people about the federal income tax. And we're going to get into that, I guess, a little bit later in the show, but I want to go through some of these current events and news stories that have been happening while I've kind of been offline for a couple of weeks. I guess everybody's seen now that it's coming out exactly as I told you 7.5 years ago. Obama, Biden, Comey, Clapper, and Brennan conspired to make it all up. Every single bit of the Russia, Brady Bunch nonsense, Masha, all of that crap was straight up lies manufactured by the intelligence agencies under orders from the top. Barack Obama. The information has been released by Tulsi Gabbard, who's in charge of the agency now, and it is absolutely clear from the documents that these treasonous, seditious pigs did everything they could to attempt a bloodless coup in the Trump's first administration by interfering with every single thing he was trying to do, and doing successfully, because if you remember, before COVID hit, we had a booming economy, low inflation, low prices, low oil, and things were going along well. And they made up all the COVID stuff too. That was all fraudulent lies. COVID was an exercise in psychological behavioral control. It had nothing to do with vaccination or keeping people safe. It was how much liberty could we scare the people into giving up under threat of medical disease. So it's coming out. It's all gone down. The Democrats have been undermining the constitutional operation of the government for what? Since 1960? Yeah, I think so. This was an attempted coup by the intelligence communities, and every single one of the pigs should be sent to prison. And anyone who thinks Trump's name is in the Epstein files, which the Democrats had for 3.5 years while Biden was president, anybody thinks the Biden administration had that information and didn't publicize it and use it against Donald Trump in every way they could, just the same way they manufactured all the other nonsense, they would have done it. He's not in the Epstein files in a negative way. That's all nonsense. If the Democrats had had that information, you can bet it would be out on the streets. All the liberals screaming that nonsense now are just straight up idiots. brainwashed, drunken morons on the liberal Kool-Aid of socialism, communism, and the derangement of Trump derangement syndrome, literally. Nothing to do about America or trying to make America better. Every bit of the Democratic Party is focused on going after Donald Trump without regard for the consequences to the American people or the operations of the government, as witnessed by what they did in his first term. And of course, the Democrat Party is disintegrating before our very eyes. There's no longer any middle ground in the Democratic Party. It's been completely co-opted by the far left, progressive, radical student element in it that they're still wooing, have been playing to with policy decisions for, what, 20 years? But the party is disintegrating. Commie Mamdani won the Democratic primary in New York City. The party is led by socialist Bernie Sanders, Elizabeth Warren, AOC, Rashida Tlaib, and the other socialist Democrats who've been vocal. There's no middle ground left. And in New York, now there are 3 Democrat candidates. Mamdani, who won the primary, Cuomo, who wants to run, he lost in the primary, he wants to run as an independent, but he's really a Democrat. He's what's left of the middle of the Democrat Party. And of course, you have the existing mayor, Eric Adams. The Democrats have 3 candidates on the ticket in New York. A Republican could actually win if he can consolidate the Republican vote, even in New York City, where Republicans haven't had a chance since Giuliani, I guess, would be it. So, Commie Mamdani wants to run New York and put in state-run grocery stores, which, you know, state-run grocery stores don't have food in them. They distribute bread, maybe, and cheese if they got their surplus shipment that week. That's it. There's already a city-run grocery store, I think it was in Kansas City, and there was a woman outside of it saying, this store is crazy. They never have any food. The shelves are empty. There's no meat. There's no vegetables. This is what a state-run store is. You don't believe me? Go ask any Cuban or Russian that remembers what it was like under the socialist regimes of Castro and the Soviet Union. Go ahead, go ask them what the state-run grocery stores have or don't have. Yeah, right. Oh, and Mamdani wants to eliminate private property in New York City. Oh, that's going to go over big. Yeah, right. New York City, the wealthiest city in the country, and they're going to vote for giving up private property. Oh my God. I'm sorry, but I don't think so. No, I don't think so. So the Democratic Party, as I said, is disintegrating before our eyes. It's splitting into the far left extreme socialist and remnants in the middle of what used to be a, just slightly left of center, liberally oriented policy. It's now become progressive radical extremism on every issue. No oil. Drive the price of oil through the roof, which drives inflation through the roof, as we've just witnessed in 4 years of Democratic control. Open borders, which increases crime and strains and stresses the social welfare systems we have in America, the safety net for our own homeless, poor, and indigent and uneducated and sick. It's just all the resources are being diverted by Democrat administrations in the liberal cities to illegal aliens, not to citizens. And you know why, of course, I've told you many times. It's because they want to buy those votes. It's just exactly what they're doing with the Social Security program, using it to buy the votes of insecure elderly who are too wealthy to be eligible for a welfare social safety net program like Social Security, which was sold to us in the late 30s as security, Social Security is a safety net for widows and orphans who slip through the cracks and aren't able to take care of themselves. It's not supposed to be an entitlement for the upper middle class, so they get $3,500 every month when they have over $1 million worth of assets, or $500,000 worth of assets, or $250,000 worth of assets. At what level should you be eligible for Social Security? Because it's not a retirement program, it's not a pension, and there is no guarantee. It's a welfare system where you might be eligible for the benefit when you reach age of eligibility. But the government can rewrite the rules and eliminate the program at any point in time. And of course, I'm not advocating right now for its complete elimination, but if you want the program to be solvent for more than the next 5 years, you need to start means testing your recipients. And anyone who has over some congressionally settled number of assets versus liabilities, like 300,000, 400,000, you shouldn't be eligible for Social Security if you have that much net worth. And you shouldn't get Social Security payments until your net worth falls below that level of eligibility. Then the money will go to people that actually need it, instead of the bulk of the resources being consumed by individuals that don't need it, but don't want to spend their own money as long as the government is passing out cash to the upper middle class to buy their votes. And that's what's being done with it, and that's what was being done with the social service monies being given to the illegal aliens. The Democrats are buying votes by passing out money, running it out, destroying the currency without regard for the fact that as goes the currency, so goes the fate of the nation and the quality of life of its people. You destroy the money, you destroy the currency, and you destroy the government, the nation, and the economic vitality, productivity, and quality of life of the American people in toto. All destroyed. And what has Donald Trump done? Well, in the last 6 months, inflation's come down to 1.7% year over year, 0.2% on the wholesale index year over year. Inflation has been conquered in 6 months. Why? Not because Donald Trump got involved and told companies they had to lower their prices, but because he got involved and lowered the cost of energy for all the producers. With gas and oil back down at reasonable levels, people don't have to raise their prices to cover the cost of energy. And that gives you back the inflation rate, which has fallen under Trump, again, to 1.7%. And Powell, over at the Federal Reserve, refuses to acknowledge the economic recovery well underway and still has interest rates at 4.5%. The rest of the world is paying 2% or less in all the major industrial countries. It's 1.5%, 1%, 2%, and all the other major. Powell refuses to lower the rate because he has been political. He politicized the Fed when he lowered interest rates a few months before the election to help Joe Biden in a moribund economy destroyed by inflation and high energy costs. And now he refuses to lower interest rates to admit the economic recovery being affected through the implementation of Donald Trump's energy policies, trade policies, immigration policies, border policies, digital currency policies. Okay, I hear the first commercial break coming up. We'll be back in 5 minutes. This is Thomas Freed on the Liberty Works Radio Network. Get signed up. We'll be back in 5. Okay, this is Thomas Fried on the Liberty Works Radio Network. This is the Truth Attack Hour, and I got a couple of more current event points I wanted to cover before we move on to my favorite topic, which, of course, is the maladministration of the income tax by the IRS, the federal courts, and the DOJ. And if you want to get fully informed on that, you ought to find your way over to taxfreedom.com and start reading. And if you know anyone who's dealing with the IRS or the DOJ in court, you need to send them over to irszoom.com, where they can buy the document templates that they need to defend themselves for, well, answering the IRS. It's $30, $40, or $50 a letter. and in court it's anywhere from 75 to 250 per document. So, if you need help, irszoom.com. If you want to become informed and aware, taxfreedom.com. Okay, so in current events, Biden is getting $10 million for his quote-unquote book deal. Yeah, right. Like he's going to be able to remember anything at all. This is going to be a biography written by somebody else. It's not even autobiography or memoirs because, as I said, I don't think he can remember anything. He just says yes to whatever is put to him. $10 million for nothing. What a waste of money. Nobody will be buying this piece of crap. It's all garbage and pure fiction, just like his whole administration was fraud and lies. Okay, so like I said, the trade deals are being announced almost daily now. We got deals with Japan, Thailand, the UK. I mean, when Trump first put in place the tariffs on these nations, there was a discussion about how we can use tariffs to replace the income tax and fund the government. And that was never Donald Trump's intention. He imposed the tariffs in order to assume a position of strength from which he could negotiate with other countries a better trade deal by agreeing to reduce the tariffs he'd just put in place in exchange for the foreign country reducing or eliminating the tariffs that it has had in place for 50 years or longer in some cases on American goods, effectively locking American products out of foreign markets. For example, American beef has not been available for sale in England, and that's just been changed. There's a whole new market to sell into for the American beef ranchers. And for the first time, I bet, since World War II, shortly after, rice is being allowed to be imported into Japan. American rice is going to be sold in Japan, and beef in England. These are just two of the examples of how Trump is using the tariffs to negotiate larger, more open, less costly foreign marketplaces for American producers and companies to sell into without the punishing tariffs that have discouraged or prohibited that sort of ability to sell into foreign markets for however long those foreign tariffs have been in place, many of which have been in place forever. So the policy positions are working, negotiating from a position of strength. He is compelling, forcing, persuading foreign countries to drop their tariffs and open their markets to U.S. goods, which bodes well for the U.S. marketplace. And the stock market, both the NASDAQ and the Dow and the S&P 500 are all at or nearly at all-time highs. And with each trade deal, things get stronger. If Powell would reduce interest rates by half a point, should come down a point, but he'll never do that. He might lower them a quarter point. I think they're meeting tomorrow. So Trump went to the Federal Reserve today to talk about the overruns in building the new reserve building, to pretend like he and Powell are getting along just fine. But he wants interest rates lower, and he's absolutely right. 4.5% is killing the U.S. real estate market, as it ends up with a 6.75% or 7% mortgage, which is way too high. People don't want to sell because they have to buy something new at the higher mortgage rate, and people who are trying to buy can't afford the 7% mortgage. If the government wanted to do something for the real estate market, they should use HUD to subsidize first-time purchasers at a 2% interest rate. Do you know what the difference is between 8% and 2% on a $150,000 mortgage? An 8% mortgage takes like $1,200 a month for 30 years, totaling at over $400,000 in payments. $250,000 in interest on a $150,000 loan. If you take that same mortgage at a 2% loan on a 15-year term, the monthly payment is only $750, and the total interest paid across 15 years is only $32,000. You save the purchaser $220,000 across 15 years of payment. If you want to improve real estate, that's how you do it, is you subsidize first-time purchases or primary homes with a 2% mortgage. Anybody who can't make the 2% mortgage will easily be able to sell the property if that mortgage is transferable, so that it gets repaid by someone who assumes the loan if the borrower can't fulfill the obligation even at 2%, which occasionally happens, but would happen far less than occurs at 7 to 8%. So that's how you stimulate housing, is you subsidize the mortgage rate. But by keeping interest rates at 4.5%, Powell is making absolutely sure that real estate can't participate in the economic recovery, that there will continue to be a housing shortage, that there will continue to be a shortage of homes for sale, and that there will continue to be a shortage of housing in the cities where they've loaded and packed in all the illegal aliens. Because let's face it, even though Trump is going after as many of the criminals as he can, they're not going to deport 20 million illegal aliens. So that's where we're at. Okay, let's switch topics and get back to talking about the federal income tax and its maladministration. As I've been talking for the last 6 months, the government's argument position that the tax is a direct tax without subjectivity to any constitutional limitation, neither apportionment of the tax if it were direct, nor uniformity of the tax if it's indirect, position has been exposed as a complete and total constitutional fraud by the Supreme Court, which has declared that the income tax is an indirect tax under Article 1, Section 8, Clause 1. It's not a direct tax under the 16th Amendment. So what I wanted to look at today was how the regulatory deference under the Chevron doctrine, which has been displaced by the Loper-Bright decision, which says you can't use regulations to go beyond the statutes, and that the courts can no longer defer to the government agencies' administrative interpretation of the statute, which they put in regulation. And oftentimes, the regulation goes beyond what the statute commands because of the way it's interpreted by the government agency, which is always interpreting everything it can to increase the power of the agency. And when you provide regulatory deference under the Chevron doctrine to the government agencies to basically write their own laws by regulations or through regulations that go further than the language of the statute actually provides, commands, or allows, you have unleashed the tyranny of the government bureaucracy to write its own laws to control the American people. And that's exactly what they've done in every institution. EPA, OSHA, the IRS, all of them, HUD, USDA, they're all interpreting laws through their own regulations in a manner that goes far beyond the actual command of the statute. How does this play out with respect to the federal income tax? Well, when you argue, as they have been arguing wrongfully for 45 years, actually it's more like 70, but officially for 45 under circuit court precedents that reversed the true Supreme Court holding in Bershaber, when they argue that the tax is a direct tax without limitation of apportionment or uniformity, well then how is that direct tax to be applied? Well, they did that through Section 1, a tax imposed on taxable income, and then Section 63, taxable income defined as Section 61 gross income. So magically, all of a sudden, rent, interest, dividends, alimony, tips, salaries, wages, compensation, annuities, everything earned by the citizens in the 50 states that is not taxable to the federal government by impost, duty, or excise, taxable indirectly under Article 1, Section 8, it all of a sudden all becomes taxable as a direct tax on gross income, which is all sources of earnings earned by citizens. So there's your application of the tax as a direct tax that's inferred through the Section 61 list of sources, which most people should know is what the government argues in court and has been arguing since 1955, and the Commissioner v. Glenshaw Glass decision, which presumed, without stating such, that the income tax was a direct tax under the 16th Amendment, that by the amendment allowed Congress to tax all accessions to wealth of the American people. And that led, of course, to the misbelief that all sources of earnings earned by the American citizens in the 50 states, as defined under Section 61, were all taxable directly to the federal government because it was a direct tax under the 16th Amendment. But what happens when the Supreme Court says it's not a direct tax? It's an indirect tax under Article 1, Section 8, Clause 1. Well, that provision of the Constitution only allows taxation, federal taxation, by impost, duty, and excise. Impost tax foreign activity, foreign imports, and in foreign places, like territories, possessions, and in foreign countries under treaties. Duties tax exported goods. We don't have any of those, other than the prohibition on selling stuff to Iran or Russia or China, but we have duty-free shops because we have pretty much foregone all taxes on exported goods. We don't punish our manufacturers for successfully selling into foreign markets. So we don't have duties. Impost tax foreign activity, and excises, the third category of indirect taxation authorized under Article 1, Section 8, Clause 1. Excise taxes the manufacture, consumption, and sale of commodities within the country, things like alcohol, tobacco, and firearms. It taxes licenses to pursue certain occupations, like selling alcohol, tobacco, and firearms. And it taxes the corporate privilege, where excises are seen and held to be a privilege tax imposed on some privilege enjoyed, either through the licensing of activity of commodities or the corporate privilege. So excises tax privileges, but which one of those, impost, duty, or excise, taxes the labor of American citizens in the 50 states conducted by right without enjoyment, use, or grant of any privilege that would make the activity subject to federal taxation? There isn't any. There isn't any basis for indirect taxation of your activity in the 50 states. Okay, I hear the second commercial break coming up. This is Thomas Freed on the Liberty Works Radio Network. We'll be back in 5 with more on more and other tax topics. Okay, this is Thomas Freed on the Liberty Works Radio Network. This is the Truth Attack Hour, and let's just finish this up. So, the income tax has been enforced by the federal government as though it were a direct tax authorized to be enforced on all sources of earnings as gross income under Section 61, which is what's defined as taxable income under Section 63. Of course, all of this ignores the fact that taxable income can only be income that is constitutionally taxable. It can't just be everything that you earn because Congress writes it down. It has to be constitutionally taxable first. And that's why they've had to argue it was a direct tax on gross income, because that's the only way to get around the limitations on taxation. It's a non-apportioned direct tax that taxes all sources of earnings under a statute without regard for the constitutional limitation on taxable income, which is only income earned from an activity or transaction subject to an impost on foreign activity, a duty on exported good, or an excise on privilege. But none of those exist. There's no foreign tax, there's no export, there's no privilege in earning rent or interest or dividends or alimony or tips or commissions or annuities. None of those things are sources of income taxable indirectly by impost, duty, or excise. They don't exist. And of course, they're not taxable. Section 61 was enacted as part of a tax treaty, the Canadian Tax Treaty in 1918. It was not part of the original legislation of 1913, a tariff act, a tariff being one form of an impost, where the income tax is a tax, according to the Supreme Court, that is collected at the source through the duty of the corporations, etc., to retain and pay the sum of the tax. It's a collected tax. It's indirect. That's what the Supreme Court found. That's what they tested. The indirect collection and payment of the tax is in statute through Section 7701A16, defining the tax collector created in law by the original legislation. That's 7701A16. Sections 14, 41, 42, and 43 are referenced in that defining code section, and they require the collection of the tax by the withholding agent, the tax collector, only from foreign persons. And 1461 makes the tax collector liable for what he has collected from the foreigners by withholding money as tax from payments made to them, non-resident aliens and foreign corporations. That is the only authority in law to collect the tax. And that's why they've had to lie and make it a direct tax, because the indirect implementation of the tariff as an impost only authorizes and commands the collection of the tax from foreign persons. And then you have the corporate excise since 1909 that applies to all businesses, corporations, foreign and domestic. So the original income tax is in the law as an indirect tax through a tax that is imposed on as a rate of tax on taxable income under Section 1. It's not even a tax imposed on a person. It's a rate of tax imposed on taxable income on different classes of persons. Married, single, married but filing separately, heads of household. Where does the federal government get the jurisdictional authority to tax married people? That's not impost, duty, or excise. That's direct taxation. Or is it indirect when enforced only against persons in the territories and possessions as shown in the 1939 law? And only as a tariff when enforced by collection from foreign persons allowed in America. This is what's in the statutes, an indirect collection of the tax and payment of the tax by the collector who has been allowed to shift the burden of the tax from his own pocket to the pocket of the person from whom the tax was withheld and collected. It's like a store paying sales tax. They never pay tax out of their own pocket. They only turn over what they have collected from the customers, who are not the actual taxpayer because they have no duty in law to pay the tax to the Treasury. Only the collector is the taxpayer because he is the only person with a statutory duty to pay the tax over to the Treasury, the state Treasury in the case of a sales tax, and the federal Treasury in the case of a withholding agent collecting income tax by withholding money as tax from payments made to foreign persons. There's no authority to collect tax indirectly from American citizens until 1945, when they created a whole new class of collectors called employers, who aren't given authority specifically to collect tax from citizens. Only employees who ask for it, authorize it, and allow it on a W-4, which the entire American population has been deceived since World War II into allowing. And of course, they have to have your allowance because they can't force you to pay a tax before it's legally due without violating the prohibition under the Constitution's 13th Amendment on involuntary servitude. To force you to service a future tax before it's a legal obligation is involuntary servitude. That's why they need your allowance and permission. That's why they want you to sign a W-4. And of course, the only liability for tax that's in the statutes is the indirect liability of the collector. So how do individuals become liable when there's no statutory liability? Oh, well, that means we got to go read Section 6201, Assessment Authority. It says the authority to assess tax applies to Subtitle E, and taxes imposed on commodities and taxes shown on returns. That's why they want you to file a return, because otherwise they can't assess the tax. It needs to be on a return. And it's the return that makes you liable. And that's how they get you to pay a direct tax by voluntary self-assessment through an ignorance of the knowledge of what is taxable income and what is not under the Constitution. And of course, the courts have been lying to you since the end of World War II about that matter, telling you it's a direct, not apportioned tax, not subject to any constitutional limitation. And everything you earn is subject to the tax. But where's the liability for tax? There's a rate of tax imposed on taxable income in Section 1. Section 63 says taxable income is gross income. Section 61 says gross income is this list of sources: interest, dividend, rent, alimony, commissions, tips, etc., etc. But where's the liability for the tax? There isn't any. There isn't any. So what did the government do to try and argue in court that there is a liability for tax? They made it up in a regulation, of course, using the regulatory deference of Chevron, the Chevron doctrine. They simply made it up. Section 1, tax imposed, Title 26, imposes, as I've said, a rate of tax on taxable income of different classes of persons. But it says nothing about who will be liable for a rate of tax. How are you liable for a rate? You're liable for an assessment or an amount collected. You're not liable for a rate of tax because you're married. And the statute doesn't say that. It imposes the rate of tax on taxable income without specifying how liability will be determined. That's done in 1461, where it says the liability for tax lies at the doorstep of the collector, who collected it from a foreign person. So the government couldn't live with that. They had to make up a direct liability, so they put it in the regulations for Section 1, tax imposed. You're liable for the tax. And they did that under the regulatory deference of Chevron. But under Loper-Bright and its displacement of the Chevron doctrine, the courts can no longer allow the government to argue that liability for the tax arises out of a regulation that goes substantially further than the statute does. So their liability for the direct tax is now gone as well. The Supreme Court says it's not direct. The Supreme Court says it's indirect. The Supreme Court says regulatory deference under Chevron is gone. So there's no liability for tax in statute. None can be manufactured by regulation. 6201 requires a return. So what happens if a citizen refuses to file a Form 1040, which, by the way, cannot be shown in law to be required by law to satisfy the tax imposed on Section 1? That's not a required form. They just want you to think it's mandatory and have lied to you about it being mandatory for 65, 75 years in order to cajole, convince, force you to file a tax return, self-assessing a direct tax that doesn't exist under the Constitution, but which is in fact the second plank of the Communist Manifesto. That's what the courts have been enforcing. Communism, the direct taxation of the American people under a quasi-system of enslavement that takes from the people the property and fruits of labor that are rightfully theirs and are not rightfully subject to any federal taxation by impost, duty, or excise under Article 1, Section 8, Clause 1. So they're using regulatory deference to manufacture a fraudulent allegation of liability for tax, not laid in statute, but invented in order to engineer an apparent support for the erroneous argument position that the federal personal income tax is a direct, non-apportioned tax without subjectivity to any of the limitations imposed on federal taxation, neither as a direct tax nor as an indirect tax. Because indirect taxes, of course, have to be uniform, and when you tax citizens under different brackets at different rates of tax, that's not uniform taxation. And to argue geographical uniformity is the controlling application with respect to the taxation of citizens opens the door to the government passing a tax that taxes Jews at one rate and Christians at another, or blacks at one rate and whites at another, or gays at one rate and straight at another, or men at one rate and women at another, or elderly at one rate and the young at another, or the rich at one rate and the poor at another. And the fact of the matter is Congress has no authority whatsoever to discriminate against the American people on any of those bases, and claiming that it's all okay because it's geographically uniform because all the blacks, Jews, Christians, white, gays, etc. are being treated equally badly in all 50 states is constitutional nonsense. Absolute nonsense! Graduated tax brackets are based on the power of Congress to discriminate against the inanimate commodities and articles of commerce subject to excise, duty, and impost taxation, and to discriminate against the inanimate corporate person, the privileged licensed person, and foreign person. But they have no constitutional authority whatsoever to discriminate against American citizens on any basis, including levels of income, wealth, or any of the other elements. And to argue that it's perfectly okay because they're treated the same in all 50 states is, as I said, constitutional nonsense. You can't tax the Jews at 90% and Christians at 10% and say it's okay because they're all treated the same that way in New York, California, Florida, Illinois. It's all nonsense. It's all fraud. Okay, this is Thomas Freed on the Liberty Works Radio Network. I'm pretty sure I hear the end of the show coming up. Find your way over to taxfreedom.com and start reading the articles that lay this all out for you so that everybody can understand what's been done to the American people by the IRS and the lower courts.